All right, let's talk about React. Right, so JavaScript has come a long way since its modest beginnings when it was meant for some light interaction with users, where we would perhaps use it for popping up some alerts, perhaps doing some validation on the client, and perhaps doing some animation, some light DOM manipulation. It's more and more. As we have been demanding more and more of our client-side application, we had to grow new tools and new libraries to help us work with that. Just the same evolution that happened on the server side, using inventing .NET or creating the J2EE and creating all these frameworks in the back end. All that evolution happened because we needed higher level of abstractions that automated a lot of the boilerplate stuff that we were writing ourselves, right? We would, once we wrote enough times accessing a database, we identified some good patterns, right? Design patterns, and we say, oh, you know what? What if we modularize that and we call it a data access object, right? We identified that it was a good practice to break up large applications into 3 buckets, the model, the view, and the controller. And that seemed to play nice, building something big. So creating all these good practices, all these design patterns, all these frameworks, helped us deal with complexity. All these frameworks that are hanging around is all an attempt for us to deal with the growing complexity of applications, right? With simple animation, simple validation, we could have just stayed with plain old JavaScript. As client-side applications became more and more heavy, we had to also make our tools more and more complex, right? And you've seen a lot of these frameworks borrow many of the same ideas that have been around for quite a while already on the Java world, in the C# world, in the .NET, that have been very successful on the server side. Now be using the same identical ideas, but now on the client side, again, because of the complexity. Things such as inversion of control, MVC, all these controllers and services, all these things are things that matured and became very, very successful on the server side, right? We're just, the client side is kind of like catching up to things that are very, very well mature on the server side, yes? And the reason that the client side has become so popular, folks have been demanding that applications behave more and more like desktop applications, right? We see when we're accessing a desktop application that it's very responsive. We move the mouse and it immediately responds to us. We have a very, very good experience. Whereas web applications before single-page applications, we're very clunky. You clicked on something, you had to wait for the page to reload. It went out to the server, and the server had to compute so they're very, very clunky. The example I always give is when I first became aware of single-page applications is contrasting the experience that from MapQuest and Google Maps. Right, that was I think Google Maps was the first single-page application that just hit me. It says, wow. Right, you're at one page, you directly interact with the map, you flick it, and it animates loading new content, and it never leaves the page. Right, it's always in the same page, as opposed to contrasting that with the experience, the old MapQuest, right, where you had exactly the same use cases. You could still pan right, pan left, zoom out, same exact use cases. Right, it's nothing that you could do on Google that you cannot do in MapQuest. It's just that the experience was completely different. Right, one was very responsive, very direct manipulation as opposed to indirect manipulation, and that was just such a much better experience. And they were using these brand new ideas of the single-page application, where you had a very heavy, much heavier client on the client side that required an equivalent complex framework to deal with the growing complexity. Right, many libraries and frameworks have been around. One of the more successful originally was Angular. Was one of the more successful at the beginning. I think they did a strategic blunder when they went to Angular 2. When they did a very hard re-engineering of their framework that made it completely incompatible. That new applications were completely incompatible with previous versions, and that kind of gave a pause of some investments, some firms that said, well, no, I mean, if I want to go to Angular 2, I have to completely throw away my code base, and that made it very hard for folks to even consider moving on to Angular 2. I think this gave a nice window of opportunity for other players in the market to be noticed. Things like React and Vue and Ember and several other competing folks, and I think they've taken away a lot of market share from Angular. Nevertheless, both of them are fairly competitive. A lot of the same ideas now apply to both of them. They're kind of like copying on each other some of the best ideas, and we'll see a lot of the same concept, which is great. I think that React has a much easier entry point of a learning curve, has a shallower learning curve, but introduces a lot of the same concepts we'll revisit in Angular. I think if we were to study with Angular, it would have been a huge, steeper learning curve. Whereas when you get to Angular, you'll find that, oh, this is easy, because you've seen already components, you already know what a single page application is, you already know what some of these concepts are, so you're not relearning any of this, right? So it's a nice segue onto Angular, okay? Not that Angular is any easier, right? It's just that because you've seen React, then Angular will seem easier, right? All right, so React. It's sponsored by Facebook, like many of these libraries or frameworks are sponsored by some larger corporations that use some of these same libraries within their own development. And if you this is the official website. I encourage you to visit this and go through some of the documentation. We're not going to be covering the entire breadth of the it would take just a whole course only for React, but we'll give you enough to be dangerous to implement things that are fairly useful, and give you a taste on what you could build. But certainly the most common, most useful things we'll be touching on, such as navigation, maintaining state, using third-party rendering libraries and things like that. One of the best ways to get started is to install one of their tools called the Create React app. I don't see it here. So it's a Node.js application that you can install locally on your machine, and you can just say Create React app. You give it the name of the application, and it creates for you a boilerplate starting position that already implements a lot of the best practices in React, right? Already creates all the tools that you need. That will compile the code onto low level JavaScript, which comes to mind. What do you mean by compiling? The whole point of JavaScript was that there was no compiling, right? That you could have JavaScript as an interpreted language, right? The browser would just read JavaScript and it can execute it right away. But as we've introduced new features to the language, new languages like TypeScript and JSX and all these other languages, which improve our productivity, browsers have not kept up, right? To be able to interpret all these new languages and all these new features for the language. So we see a little bit of fragmentation on what the languages are doing, and we already saw one way of going about dealing with the fragmentation. jQuery is certainly one particular way of dealing with fragmentation, right? Another way of dealing with fragmentation is to allow you to code in any language you want, as long as we provide a compiler or something that can transform whatever language you want to write it on, and then compile it down to the minimum common denominator JavaScript that all browsers understand, right? And that's exactly what some of these tools available out there, such as Babel, right, allows you to do is code in any version of JavaScript you want, or TypeScript, or whatever, right? It'll convert it down to some other representation that is equivalent, right, to whatever you're coding at a high level. So this allows us to, it frees us to explore, the very latest features of the JavaScript language. Even consider other languages like a TypeScript or JSX, and new features that are very exciting, without worrying about how is this going to be interpreted by the underlying browser. But nevertheless, you need these transpilers. They're not really compilers. The transpilers, they take a high-level language, they compile it into low-level, some low-level JavaScript that most browsers will understand, right? And they can do this on the fly, right? As you minimizing any cycle of compiling and debugging and whatnot. Okay, make sense? So we're going to be introducing React. We're going to be using the Create React App tool. We'll be deploying it on Heroku and start coding away and talking about some of the features. All right, excellent.